everyone. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to go over The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, which is one of the stories you had to read for homework last week. So go ahead and pull up our PowerPoint here. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of those literary elements that we learned about last week. So we're going to look at how this story's structure, point of view, setting and atmosphere, and imagery and symbolism all work together to help us understand the theme better. Okay, so first things first, a brief summary of the story, just in case any parts of it left you a little confused. What we have here is a woman, Mrs. Mallard, who in the very beginning of the story finds out that her husband has died in a train accident. And at first, she has sort of your typical reaction. She is overcome with grief. And, Josephine and Richards, the sister and friend, are concerned because Mrs. Mallard apparently is known to have some heart trouble. So they're very concerned about her well-being. So she goes upstairs to sort of have some time alone, even though they're not real sure that that's a great idea. They understand and give her privacy, so she's in her bedroom for most of the story. Once she is in her bedroom alone, she's obviously sad, but she begins contemplating the nature of marriage, and she is looking out her window, and outside are all of these signs of springtime. And springtime is obviously a time of rebirth, new beginnings, hope, optimism. And despite her feelings of sadness and grief, she also begins to feel almost like a weight has been lifted. And she realizes that with her husband gone, she will be free to be her own independent person. And she fully admits that, her husband was very kind and loving. He was not a bad man, but marriage can just be stifling at times, especially, when this story is taking place. Marriage wasn't necessarily something that was socially acceptable to decide what, that you didn't want to do it, that you didn't want to be married. And it wasn't really even socially acceptable to wait until later in life to get married. So she probably married at a fairly young age, and possibly not to a man that she was especially in love with, despite how kind he was. She says, it's a two-way street. Marriage is an institution where you sort of end up imposing your will on your spouse. And again, it works both ways. That's just sort of how it is. And now that she's a widow, she can sort of be free and independent in a socially acceptable way. And this fills her with great joy. And she admits that, there's going to be sadness, there's going to be grief, but past that is this new life, this new world of opportunity for her. So she goes through quite a series of emotions and thoughts during that hour alone in her room, and comes out much better than when she went in. And she goes back downstairs, and lo and behold, her husband walks through the door, perfectly alive and well. And she then dies, most likely from a heart attack, especially considering they've already hinted that she has had heart trouble. So of course, everyone in the story, even the doctor, believe that she died because she was so overcome with the joyous shock of her husband being alive that her heart couldn't handle it, the joy that kills. We as the reader, though, we know that it was not a joy that killed her. It was the shock of seeing him alive and knowing that she would still continue to simply be Mrs. Mallard. That all of the freedom and independence that she had just imagined for herself was yanked away immediately as soon as we realize he's alive. So that is what happens in this story. Let's take a look at those literary elements and see how all of those work together to help us understand some of the underlying themes in this story. Okay, so first, the structure. It's called The Story of an Hour. And all of the action in the story takes place within that hour. From the time Richards comes and reveals that Brentley had been on that train, allegedly, from the time Brentley walks through the door and Mrs. Mallard dies, all of that happens in an hour. And that is why the story is as short as it is, and even why the structure of the story is short. There's very, short paragraphs. Some paragraphs are just 2 or 3 sentences. It's very dense, and it's actually a really perfect choice because by sharing what happens in that 1 hour span and doing it in such a short story, Chopin kind of packs all this intensity into this story to mirror the intensity of that hour. Notice that there's no background information, there's no flashbacks, there's no excessive narration. Literally every sentence in the story has a purpose and is important. It's very deliberate how it is structured. It's almost poetic in some ways. And if you think about it, we've learned, poems, some of them do tell a story, but because it's poetry, it normally can't go on forever. I mean, there is such a thing as epic poetry, which could be a whole book that's one long poem that tells a very, detailed story. We did not read anything like that, thank goodness. But we did read some poems that sort of told a story. And it was still sort of in a condensed form. And when you are using a genre that requires you to be very economical with your writing, you have to rely on certain elements and certain techniques to tell the story and get the emotion across. And that's where we learned about some of those, poetic language devices, like similes and metaphors and things like that. And Chopin uses some of that in this short story as well. She's got some very, moments of repetition. The words open and free get repeated a lot. We know that repetition usually is to draw our attention to something. Her phrasing and sentence structure can be, repetitive in some ways. And it's all to bring attention to those moments so that we can sort of hone in on the importance of those moments without needing excessive narration to explain it to us. There's also alliteration and internal rhyme. All of these structural and stylistic choices make this really short story super powerful. It's quite intense, and she packs a lot into it in such a short amount of time. And it mirrors the actual story, which is kind of cool. Point of view is kind of interesting because we start off with objective point of view. In the very beginning, it's almost like, again, sort of like a newspaper report. All we get is what could be seen, right? Richard's sharing the news, Mrs. Mallard's reaction, Josephine's reaction. There's nothing shared in terms of any of the characters' thoughts or feelings. But then when Mrs. Mallard goes upstairs to her room and she's alone, the point of view switches to limited omniscient. And remember, a limited omniscient point of view is when the narrator is not a character, but does have access to a character's thoughts and feelings. And in this case, it's Mrs. Mallard's, right? While she's in that room alone, She thinks that she's a widow. She's no longer a wife, and she's free to express her thoughts and feelings, so the narrator has access to those. But then we get to the end of the story when she goes back downstairs and she is around other people again. The point of view switches back to objective. So it's almost like the point of view is mirroring how she feels. And in the beginning, she feels very like she doesn't have access to her own thoughts and opinions and feelings. She is simply Mrs. Mallard. She is a wife. That is her role, and that is the extent of her being. But when she is alone and thinks that she is a widow, and she's starting to embrace that freedom and independence that will come with being a widow, she is allowed to then have her own thoughts and feelings. And so we get to observe that. But as soon as she goes back downstairs, the world shifts again, the point of view shifts again, because as we know, she has simply gone back to being Mrs. Mallard. She is not a widow. She is very much still married. Her husband is very much still alive. So it's very interesting how that point of view shifting coincides with what Mrs. Mallard is experiencing along the way. All right, what about setting? Setting is super important to this story. Remember, setting is both location and time. The location for the majority of this story is Mrs. Mallard's bedroom. And the bedroom actually becomes a symbol in the story. So we're going to discuss that element here in a bit. But the other component of setting, time, I do want to emphasize here in this section because it is very integral to the story. It takes place in the late 1800s. So you have to think about the women's rights during that time, the roles women were expected to play, what was socially acceptable for women during that time. We did not have a lot of rights at that time. What was expected of women was to, get married and be a wife and hopefully a mother, be a homemaker. And sure, some women may have had a job, early in their adult years, typically things like a teacher or a nurse, maybe a secretary. But it was assumed that those women would give up those jobs once they did get married. And it was expected that you would get married rather young. And the older you get without getting married, the more society looks down on you, even pities you. And obviously, the older you get, the less likely it is that you will ever get married, which is just an awful state of things, but that's what was expected. And you can kind of assume based on that there were probably many marriages during this time that, if not outright arranged, were certainly more of I don't want to say a business exchange, but somewhat. Not necessarily between like the husband and like the wife's family or father, but even between the wife and the husband, that it was, I don't want to say a marriage of convenience either, but for lack of a better term, you would find someone who was suitable, not necessarily someone you were in love with. If you're lucky, that would happen. But a lot of marriages during that time weren't necessarily based on, passion and love. Now, if at some point during your marriage, your husband dies and you are a widow, you aren't necessarily expected to remarry. You are then sort of able to be on your own without society making it even more difficult for you, or they might still pity you to a certain extent, but legally you actually had a little bit more independence. And at the very least, you didn't have another person, you didn't have a spouse or, a legal partner that you had to answer to. You could be your own person. And that is what she is coming to realize when she's in that bedroom alone, is she is entering into a new stage of her life. And she's not going to be just a wife anymore. And she doesn't even know what that means, but she knows it means that she's her own person and she doesn't have to answer to anybody else now. And that is a very freeing feeling for her. Okay. All right, the atmosphere kind of coincides with the shifts in point of view too. Because in that beginning, when we're in that public space in the living room where other characters are located and we're in that objective point of view, again, remember there's no access to thoughts or feelings. So it's kind of emotionless, which kind of mirrors how she feels, kind of spiritually dead. Like there's not much joy there. In the middle of the story, when she is alone, and the point of view switches to limited omniscient point of view, and she's looking out that window and seeing all of those signs of spring, the atmosphere shifts to being, much more hopeful and optimistic. And then, of course, when she leaves the bedroom and goes back downstairs, the point of view switches back to objective point of view. And it goes back to, we have no access to thoughts or feelings. And it's, again, kind of emotionless and spiritually and literal death happening at the end. So the mood is really bleak in the beginning and at the end, but in that whole middle section, we experience that ray of hope during that 1 hour when she believes she's free. So it's interesting that the immediate setting changes from downstairs to bedroom, back to downstairs. The point of view changes from objective, limited, omniscient, back to objective. And the atmosphere changes, from very sad and bleak to hopeful and optimistic, back to sad and bleak. So it's very interesting how all three of those elements mirror each other. And really, if you're paying attention to those, simultaneous shifts, it draws your attention to what is happening in each of those moments. All right, so the imagery in this story, I've already sort of mentioned it already. We have a lot of images of springtime when she is in that bedroom. She mentioned seeing the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. Countless sparrows twittering in the eaves, patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds, spring days and summer days, and all sorts of days that would be her own. So these are images of hope, images of new life, new beginnings. It's what she is feeling in this part of the story. So the imagery is what lets us know that what she's feeling is hope and optimism, that it's not just grief and sadness, that's how Chopin sort of clues us in to what Louise is really feeling and what this moment is that's sort of taking over and sort of bubbling out of her. If we weren't quite understanding it just based on what is happening to Louise, we can refer to the imagery to sort of explain and back up what we might be thinking but aren't sure of. So if you weren't sure what Louise was really feeling and why the word free keeps escaping from her lips, and this whole sort of tangent about marriage and imposing your will on one another, it's that imagery that helps explain it. We also have the motif of weeping. There's a lot of references to weeping and crying in the story, and rightfully so. A woman woman has just found out her husband has died, and she is sad about it. And when she gets upstairs, she sobs, and then she imagines how she's going to cry at his funeral. There's a lot of references to crying when it comes to his death, which makes sense again, but then you have to think about those images of springtime and rebirth and new beginnings. And a lot of times a good cry has a very cathartic effect, and it's a release, right? You just let it all out, and then it allows you to move forward with a clear head and a clear heart. So that also sort of, along with the springtime imagery, kind of reinforces this idea that, despite this grief and sadness that she's letting go of, it's going to allow her to move forward. And when she moves forward, we have these images of springtime that let us know she's moving forward into something hopeful and optimistic. All right, symbols. I already said before that the bedroom kind of becomes a symbol for the story. Most of the story takes place in the bedroom. So imagine, she's in this room, she's confined to be, within these four walls, which kind of mirrors how she's feeling in her marriage, confined. But we also know that while she's in this room, she's able to express her true thoughts and feelings. So she's not able to do that in her marriage where she's confined, but she is able to do this in the room where she's confined. So what is it about the bedroom that allows it to be both a symbol of her confining marriage, but also allows her to be herself? And it's because there's another feature of the bedroom, which is the window. The open window allows her to see outside, right? She sees the signs of spring, the signs of new life, the blue skies and clouds, freedom. The open window provides her a glimpse of what her life is going to be now as a widow. It represents the freedom that she has yearned for and thinks that she now has, right? So it's almost like the bedroom, sort of symbolizes the confining nature of her marriage, but there is a window of hope within it. So the window of hope within her marriage is actually the death of her husband, right? So now she can be, free and independent in a socially acceptable way. All right. But what happens when she turns away from the window? Well, we know she goes back downstairs and it all falls apart, which is a horrible thing to say because her husband is alive. That's a good thing, right? We don't want him to die. But we understand perhaps the struggle that she has been feeling. I think even today, even though divorce is much more socially acceptable, remaining single, into your adult life or forever is much more socially acceptable for women, especially, but even men. But yet, even today, people still find themselves in marriages that have become more about convenience than true love and partnership. And I think even still, we can kind of understand where she was coming from, that it's not that she's glad he died, but she's just happy that what is going to come after for her is something new and exciting. And it goes away. So what are the themes? Well, we have to think about what we learned about Louise Mallard. We have to think about the structure, the point of view, the setting and atmosphere, the imagery and symbolism, and what all of that together adds up to. And there are sort of two themes that work together, but can be stated sort of so it's almost like two prongs of the same fork, The first is the search for female identity, right? She isn't allowed to be independent or even want to be independent. She behaves as expected when she hears about her husband's death, but in private, She begins to realize that she's now an independent woman, and this is very exciting, but it goes against society's expectations. So she's actually still trying to stifle that joy. She says she tried to beat it back with her will. She's afraid to let it out, but she can't help it. And it's too strong. It bubbles out, and the word free escapes her lips. So that confined room and the open window and the imagery of the springtime outside the window reinforce this conflict between repression and freedom. So she is searching for her own identity. She yearns for her own identity. She yearns to be Louise, not just Mrs. Mallard. And when she realizes that she kind of has an out now, it's not her fault that her husband died. It's not her fault she's a widow. She can move forward and find herself, who she is, apart from just being Brentley Mallard's wife. And that's, she's excited about that. She is still sad that he's dead, but she is excited about what comes next. And then he returns and unknowingly just yanks that independence right away from her, and it disappears. That forbidden joy of independence disappears just as quickly as it came, and that brief taste of freedom and having it ripped away was enough to kill her. But the theme here is that female search for identity. The other prong of that fork, though, is the repressive nature of marriage. That is sort of the other theme that keeps popping up, And again, by 1890 standards, Louise Mallard should have been very happy. She had a kind husband who treated her well. She even admits that he had never looked save with love upon her, which means he only looked on her with love. He never looked on her with anger or resentment or anything like that. He seemed to be a very loving, caring person. Yet her face still bespoke repression, because no matter how kind her husband was, he still imposed his will on her. And she even admits that perhaps she had oppressed her husband in some ways. Like there's just this, there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So it's marriage itself that can be repressive, especially during this time when marriages weren't necessarily based on love and respect and, partnership. And when she's alone, she has this feeling of, the freedom of being an independent woman. But when he's proven to be alive, she's merely a wife again. The only way that she ends up being able to escape that repressive nature of marriage is her own death. She thought it was her husband's death that was going to allow her to escape the repressive nature of marriage, but that didn't end up happening. And I don't know that, we're supposed to walk away with this thinking that, marriage is just awful, period. But again, thinking of what marriage was like in the 1890s, perhaps, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. And, no marriage is all sunshine and roses, even the best of them, even the strongest of them. But if you never really were in love with that person to begin with, it can make it even harder to feel like you can be yourself. And I think that's what we're supposed to walk away with. It's not that just, oh, marriage sucks, period. Marriage sucks, the end. No. In the 1890s, marriage was not necessarily the best thing in the world. It could have been, not to say that every single marriage was like the Mallards, but I would be willing to bet that this was a common healing for many women during that time, if they allowed themselves to admit it And that is what Louise struggles with in the bedroom. She is afraid to let it out, right? But the feeling is so strong, she can't fight it back. She can't tamp it down. And that's where the word free keeps escaping her lips, body and soul free. So the search for female identity and the repressive nature of marriage. That is sort of what this whole story is supposed to convey to us. And the way that it is structured, the way that point of view is used, the setting and the atmosphere, the imagery and the symbolism, it all works together to highlight this two-pronged theme, right? Okay, so that is it for the story of an hour. If you have questions, please reach out. This story will show up on your short stories exam in week 10. And you're going to need to be able to discuss the theme and how those literary elements work in the story and how they relate to the theme and help reveal the theme. So everything in this PowerPoint, especially the super important elements. You'll have to be able to discuss them and how they relate to the themes. So definitely reach out if you're still questioning any of this. Otherwise, that's it for this one. And you're free to go ahead and move on to the next thing.